Hi.
Hello there. We've decided to start a new series based on the work of one of our favorite Bible teachers, Alexander McLaren, who, though he was a Scot, was famous for his association with the city of Manchester. So much so that Alexander McLaren was called McLaren of Manchester to many who didn't realize that his ancestry was Scottish. And he preached in Manchester for about 40 years before his death, just before World War I. And I didn't know this until much later, that McLaren preached from a church that was just a few miles up the road from where I was born in Stockport, in the southeast corner of Manchester. Tempting to think of what it would have been like to hear this man live, because many people in those days, in the last two generations of the Victorian era, thought of him as the greatest preacher in the world. Certainly he was second or third in fame, maybe only Spurgeon and perhaps R.W. Dale in Birmingham were more famous, or as famous as he was. So he was a Baptist, so was Spurgeon, and that gave a lot of currency or publicity to the so-called dissenting churches, because it was not cool in the Victorian era, at least in the first part of it, to be a dissenting minister, that is, outside the Church of England. So Spurgeon and Dale and McLaren gave a lot of credibility to those churches which had been excluded from even from the universities earlier in that century. So here's McLaren on Isaiah, and this is based on the very first verses of Isaiah chapter 1, which we can read from the NIV, the first 4 verses.
The vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manger. But Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel, and turned their backs on him.
McLaren entitles this chapter on Isaiah 1, The Great Suit, Jehovah versus Judah. So he frames this chapter, he believes that Isaiah frames this chapter as a lawsuit. Jehovah is taking Israel, not Israel, specifically Jerusalem and Judah, to court, because the 10 tribes have already are already judged at this point. So Isaiah apparently lived in Jerusalem. That's why this, you'll notice in the very first verse, this is about Judah and Jerusalem. Yeah. We, as witnesses, we wouldn't have noticed that. Nor would we have known that Alexander McLaren, writing these things in the 1860s through the 1890s, most of the time, most of his expositions, which, by the way, is 30 volumes altogether on Scripture, not covering every paragraph, but covering most of the Bible in his sermons. In his title, The Great Suit, Jehovah versus Judah, one of the things that astounded us in the early days was that when we started to see that Russell, the name of God was not prominent in the works of Russell in the 1880s, 90s, and the early 1900s, but astoundingly in the books of many of the preachers of Protestantism, the name was all over the place. We actually did a name count in McLaren's commentary on the Psalms. 3 volumes, by the way, in the Expositor's Bible. Over 1,000 times does McLaren cite the name Jehovah in that one volume.
Yeah, it was a surprise for me. I really had bought the Watchtower's talk of almost nobody else ever using the name, and then I find it in commentaries and in hymn books. And
so we bought the propaganda. And the reason that McLaren did it, of course, is because he saw that in the Old Testament the name is very prominent, and he wanted to make that case. although he didn't do it in the New Testament because he's loyal to the text. By the way, he was a Hebrew as well as a Greek scholar, and that's why he could write for the Expositor's Bible as well as being a great preacher.
And it fits with the Old Testament because the Old Testament is talking to God's covenant people.
Yeah.
So they identify with the name.
Mm-hmm. He begins his commentary on this section. The first bars of the great overture to Isaiah's great oratorio are here sounded. These first chapters give out the themes which run through all the rest of his prophecies. Like most introductions, they were probably written last when the prophet collected and arranged his life's labors. The text deals with the three great thoughts, the leitmotifs that are sounded over and over again in the prophet's message. So McLaren is using a musical parallel here, leitmotifs being the idea of musical themes that recur in the work. First comes the great indictment, which is what he entitles verses 2 to 4. A true prophet's words are of universal application, even when they are most specially addressed to a particular audience. Just because this indictment was so true of Judah, it is true of all men, for it is not concerned with details peculiar to a long past period and the state of society, but with the broad generalities common to us all. As another great teacher in Old Testament times said, I will not reprove thee for thy sacrifices or thy burnt offerings to have been continually before me. Isaiah has nothing to say about ritual or ceremonial omissions, which to him were but surface matters after all. But he sets in blazing light the foundation facts of Judah's and every man's distorted relation to God, and how lovingly as well as sternly God speaks through him. That divine lament which heralds the searching indictment is not unworthy to be the very words of the almighty lover of all men, sorrowing over his prodigal and fugitive sons. Nor is its deep truth less than its tenderness. For is not man's sin blackest when seen against the bright background of God's fatherly love. True, the fatherhood that Isaiah knew referred to God's relation to the nation rather than to the individual. But the great truth which is perfectly revealed by the perfect Son was in part shown to the prophet. The east was bright with the unrisen sun, and the tinted clouds that hovered above the place of its rising seemed as if yearning to open and let him through. Man's neglect of God's benefits puts him below the animals that know the hand that feeds and governs them. Some men think it a token of superior culture and advanced views to throw off allegiance to God. It is a token that they have less intelligence than their dog.
Well, there is something very beautiful and pathetic in the fact that Judah is not directly addressed, but that verses 2 to 4 are a divine soliloquy. I hope that's how you say it. They might rather be called a father's lament than an indictment. The forsaken father is, as it were, sadly brooding over his erring child's sins, which are his father's sorrows and his own miseries. In verse 4, the black catalogue of the prodigal's doings begins on the surface with what we call moral delinquencies, and then digs deeper to disclose the root of these in what we call religious relations perverted. The two are inseparably united, for no man who is wrong with God can be right with duty or with men. Notice too how one word flashes into clearness the sad truth of universal experience, that iniquity, however it may delude us into fancying that by it we throw off the burden of conscience and duty, piles heavier weights on our backs. The doer of iniquity is laden with iniquity. Notice too how the awful entail of evil from parents to children is adduced. Shall we say as aggravating or as lessening the guilt of each generation. Isaiah's contemporaries are a seed of evildoers, spring from such, and in their turn are children that are corrupters. The fatal bias becomes stronger as it passes down. Heredity is, in fact, whether you call it original sin or not.
And then he finishes this section this way, but the bitter fountain of all evil lies in distorted relations to God. They have forsaken the Lord. That is why they do corruptly. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. That is why they are laden with iniquity. Alienated hearts separate from him. To forsake him is to despise him. To go from him is to go away backward. Whatever may have been our inheritance of evil, we each go further from him. And this fatherly lament over Judah is indeed a wail over every child of man. Does it not echo in that pearl of parables? That is, he's referring here to the prodigal son in Luke. And may we not suppose that it suggested that supreme revelation of man's misery and God's love. So obviously McLaren thinks that Christ was inspired to give us the parable of the prodigal son by this narrative, which is, after all, not a parable, but a real history of God's dealings with Israel.
Yeah.
We wanted to link to a video that was based on a Ray Franz comment, where he points out the heart of the father in the prodigal son, so-called prodigal son parable, is not the heart of the Jehovah's Witness leadership, that they are not seeking the lost at all. So he makes that point, and then we thought of the connection with a series that we had participated in by Tim Keller, where he calls his series Prodigal Sons, because he observes something that you don't normally think of.
That both the sons were far from the father. The one stays, but he's obviously alienated from his father from the comments he makes. You get that impression, and you might miss that because you always think of the one that leaves and squanders.
The wastrel, yeah. So we're forced to ask the question, if we're ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, where in the parable, the so-called parable of the prodigal son, where are we as Jehovah's Witnesses in this story? And we'll conclude McLaren's chapter, The Great Suit, from Isaiah chapter 1, next time.